Shabbat Shalom, everyone. So this morning's teaching is one that I've actually have done in the past, but certainly not recently. I think it was about 7 years ago or so when I last gave this teaching. But I think it's a good one to do for several reasons. One is I think it's an important one for all the followers of Mashiach to be reminded of. If you've heard this before and you recall it, I think it's still good to be reminded of what we're going to be covering this morning. Also, as the senior rabbi mentioned, this is a period of time. The king is in the fields. We're in the 40 days of awe leading up to Yom Kippur, which is a time for reflection. It's a time for searching deep within ourselves and seeing where our standing with God, our relationship with God is. And this is one way, this teaching I think is one way for us to consider that. Because what this teaching it hopefully will do is help you have a better understanding of what type of faith, not just having faith, but exactly what type of faith we should have as the disciples of Yeshua towards God. Now, the type of faith that I'm going to be talking about this morning is one that I've labeled V'hein la faith. And in English that would translate as, but if not faith. If you recall this teaching from the past, the phrase but if not, in 3 simple words, but it comes from Daniel 3 actually. And specifically it comes from a declaration that's made by Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego proclaiming their faith to Nebuchadnezzar. And they're claiming it with this phrase, but if not. And they use that. We're going to go into the detail of what's important about this phrase. But they say this when they're confronted with the threat of being thrown into the fiery furnace. Now, just to recall the story, because we're not going to read all of it, what you have to remember is Nebuchadnezzar, he was king of Babylon. He had an idol of gold constructed. And there were certain times throughout the day when there would be certain music played. And when everyone heard the music, they were expected to fall down and worship this gold statue, this gold idol that he had constructed. And as a punishment, he said, for anyone who doesn't worship the idol at the appointed times when the music plays, their punishment would be that they would be thrown into a furnace, that they would be burned alive in a fiery furnace. And when the time came for this to be done, there were Chaldeans who were jealous of some of the Jews that served in Nebuchadnezzar's court, and were always seeking to undermine them. If you recall the book of Daniel, we see this several times where there are those who try to undermine Daniel because of the favor God had given him. Daniel's not actually in this particular story, but 3 other Jewish servants are, and they did not follow the command, of course, because they would have been violating Torah. They would have been violating the commandment to worship no other gods but the one true God. So, when this is pointed out, Nebuchadnezzar seeks to carry out the punishment. So he brings Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego before him, and he asks them straight up, why did you refuse to worship the golden image as I had commanded? And in Daniel 3:13 through 15, we hear the following.
Then Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now if you are ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, tigron, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands?
So right there at the end, when Nebuchadnezzar is challenging these 3 men, he makes a direct challenge actually to their God, to the God of Israel. He asks there, who is the God? Who is the power, in essence, that's going to deliver you from my hands, from the power that I wield? And Nebuchadnezzar, of course, as many ancient rulers of these great empires that we hear about in Scripture, to a certain degree, they conceived of themselves as being gods. After all, at this moment, Nebuchadnezzar ruled over the mightiest kingdom in the Near East, in the Middle East, probably at the world of the time. And he questioned, how could these three men think that they could rely on some other power, and he assumes they're God, and that they would be able to rescue them out of his hands. After all, he's conquered nations. He's conquered nations that relied upon their gods to rescue them, to deliver them out of his hands, and every time the nations fell. And like I said, this was common. This was a common thought in the ancient world, that if a kingdom conquered or subjugated another people, once they conquered them, this was a sign that the victorious kingdom's God was superior to the one that was defeated. Therefore, Nebuchadnezzar most likely reasoned that since he had achieved victory over the Judeans, he had destroyed Jerusalem, he had destroyed the temple, and actually there is, when you read the entire book of Daniel, there's some language to believe that actually this probably occurred very shortly after Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians did destroy Jerusalem and the temple. In fact, it's very possible maybe this idol was constructed. Some people theorize this idol was constructed as a way of celebrating his victory over them. But he's assuming to trust in some other God, to trust in some other authority to deliver you out of my hands. This is completely misplaced. Now, of course, what Nebuchadnezzar failed to realize was that he himself was actually just an instrument in the hands of the one true God. That the only reason he had risen to power, and the only reason he had victory over Judah and Jerusalem was because he was being used as a tool in the hand of the God of Israel to carry out a curse that God had promised on to the Israelites if they did not keep his commandments. They did not keep his covenant. And we see this understanding of who Nebuchadnezzar truly is in the hands of God when we read a passage like Jeremiah 21, 5-7 that says,
I myself will fight against you with outstretched hand and strong arm, in anger and in fury and in great wrath. And I will strike down the inhabitants of this city, both man and beast. They shall die of great pestilence. Afterward, declares the Lord, I will give Zedekiah, king of Judah, and his servants and the people of the city who survived the pestilence, sword, and famine, into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and into the hand of their enemies, into the hands of those who seek their lives. He will strike them down with the edge of the sword. He shall not pity them, nor spare them, or have compassion.
So if we put ourselves in this setting, we have to it's remarkable really to think of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and the faith that they were demonstrating. Because again, they themselves have been servants taken captive by the Babylonians for years. Babylon actually came up against Jerusalem 3 times. It was only the 3rd time that they came up against them that they actually destroyed the city and the temple. The 2 previous times, they had defeated the Jews, and they had taken people captive. They had taken people into exile. And they had they had replaced the king in Judah and put up another family member who would be a puppet for the Babylonian government. They had experienced their entire lives that Babylon was mightier than Judah. And despite that, and despite themselves having been born in Jerusalem and being taken into captivity, and again serving in this foreign land for all these years, and maybe having just heard the news that now Jerusalem has fallen and has been completely destroyed, despite all of this, they show this remarkable faith towards God, that God is still the one on the throne, that God is still to be respected and honored, and the covenant with him is still to be observed. And we see some of this in their response in Daniel 3:16-17, which says,
Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king.
And so you can imagine the insult, the affront to Nebuchadnezzar that this response is, and that they merely, when Nebuchadnezzar presses them and questions them, why is it that you're not following my command? Why are you not bowing down to the image as everyone else is? And the response is to say, we actually don't have to answer to you. We don't. Nebuchadnezzar believes that, and as many kings would, I hold your life in my hands. And the response to, again, is we have no need to answer you. And of course, we know the rest of the story then. As a result of this response, Nebuchadnezzar becomes furious. He has them thrown into the fiery furnace and even commands that the fire be heated 7 times more than the normal. And even the ones who are stoking the fire and then throwing them in, they get burned in the flames themselves. But yet, these 3 are protected. These 3 are not burned by the fire. They are preserved by God. And that's what we heard them say, that our God is able to deliver us. And that's what we see occur. Even to the point when you read later on, it says, not only did they not burn, but when they were brought out of the fire, it says they didn't even have the smell of fire on them. There was no smell of smoke or that there was any burning around them. And so we see from this story these 3 men that showed this great trust in the power and the sovereignty of their God. How they proclaimed to a king who, again, it would have, by all appearances, had the power of life and death over them, that they would not bow to his idol because their God would rescue them out of his hands. And so at the risk of their own lives, they proclaimed that their God was superior to this ruler. Again, probably the most powerful ruler in the earth at that time. And we see how God rewarded their faith by performing this miracle and delivering them out of the fire. Now, this is where most readers are content to stop. They take comfort that God responded to the expression of these men's faith by displaying his sovereignty over not just the rulers of Babylon. God didn't in this show that he was more powerful than Nebuchadnezzar, but actually God is showing that he's even more powerful than the physical laws of nature. You throw something into a fire that's combustible, that can burn, it should burn. But God showed that he's even able to rescue, not just out of some man's power, some earthly power, but even out of the creative order that he made, that he can rescue people out of that. And so this story brings great comfort for that reason. It demonstrates the rewards of faith in God and the rewards that come if you trust in his promises. But I argue there's even a greater demonstration of faith by these 3 men that often is entirely missed if we leave the story simply as this. They showed great faith and they were rewarded for their faith. And what we would be missing is their demonstration of what I call, but if not faith. For although they did proclaim their faith that God had sovereignty, he had power over Nebuchadnezzar, and they proclaimed something. They claimed that, but they actually proclaimed even something greater about their faith to God. For after stating that God was able to deliver them from the furnace and the Babylonian king, they said the following in Daniel 3:18.
But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up.
So they proclaimed, God can rescue us out of this flame. And that's why we're not going to follow you. We don't fear you. But then they went further and they said, but if not, v'hein la. They said in these words, but even if God chooses not to deliver us, we have faith that he will. But even if he chooses not to deliver us out of this situation, we're still not going to bow to your golden image. Having just proclaimed God can rescue them, they followed up, though, by saying that their faithfulness to God, their trust in him, their loyalty to him, and their love for him, that this was so important that even if they weren't rescued, even if they didn't have an expectation of being rescued, they would not violate his commandments, and they refused to worship this graven image. And so what they're showing is that actually their faith and their boldness was not because they truly believed God would rescue them, but it actually was their belief that we have a relationship with this God, and he's commanded us to do this. And therefore, for that reason alone, because he's our sovereign, because we are in a covenant with him, because we trust in him and his promises, we're still not going to do it. We will burn in the flames, but, we're still not going to do it. In this declaration of faith, they didn't view God as simply an entity with whom they could bargain or negotiate. Unlike some today, and especially those who follow after false hopes of the prosperity teachers, they did not approach God with an attitude that, well, if I step out in faith, or even if I do what's commanded, then God owes me something, as though I merited his grace or his favor. And that could be riches, it could be healing, it could be divine power, gifts of the Spirit, or it could be that God would reward me by helping me out of this very difficult situation. It wasn't there in their mind, they're not like proclaiming this to Nebuchadnezzar saying, hey God, look at me. I'm standing here in front, in your name in front of this great king, so you've got to help me out of this. Instead, they demonstrate this greater level, this more mature level of faith to God, in that they would not violate his commandments simply because they knew it was the wrong thing to do. It was the evil thing, it was the unholy thing to do. Their obedience was an acknowledgement of faith in God's holiness, in his righteousness, and the righteousness of his commandments, of his sovereignty over all things. Simply because God deserved obedience, they obeyed. And this is the greater faith, the faith which all of us should be demonstrating in our walk. And what I mean by but if not faith is a faith that allows us to say, God, I will show obedience to you, not out of a fear of a fiery furnace or even out of a fiery afterlife. And I will show obedience to you not out of a desire to receive riches on earth or even blessings in heaven, but I am going to show obedience to you because I know you are righteous. And you desire me to be righteous as well. And please understand, this is not to say that the other things are not true consequences of your faith or lack thereof. There are rewards. There are definitely heavenly rewards. We're promised that. And God will at times protect us. And he definitely is our protector and our provider. But the mature follower of Yeshua, those consequences, the rewards, the blessings, the protection, the provision, those actually are secondary. What comes first is I have a relationship with him. Obedience should no longer be seen as a burden to avoid punishment or an avenue that allows us to receive blessings. Rather, we should obey because why? Well, it can't be stated any simpler or more clearly than John 14:15.
If you love me, keep my commandments.
You keep his commandments, not to avoid punishment, not to receive blessings and rewards, but simply you keep his commandments because you love him. Those of you who are parents should understand this sense of love immediately. You hope your children listen to your instructions, that they listen to your teachings, and that they listen to your rules. Not because you hope to avoid having to punish them, not because you want to lavish gifts and words of praise upon them when they do listen to your instructions, but you want your children to show obedience because they love you. And in that love, they trust that you love them and you have their best interests in mind. Such a desire to see loving obedience from our children is what God desires for those of us who belong to him. A faith that rests upon the relationship between him and his creation. Not a faith that rests simply because my creation wants to avoid being punished or my creation wants to be blessed. But no, that they want the relationship, then that's it. One of the best examples we see of this in Scripture, both the misguided forms of faith that act out of hope for results, which can, and when we just rest on those results, I think this story illustrates where it causes us to lose faith. But also, it demonstrates the type of obedient faith that we should all be seeking, is the events that surround the 12 spies and their report about the land of Israel. So having given the children of Israel the instructions of the covenant that God made at Sinai, God then, after a year, leads them to the southern border of the land that he had promised Abraham. Following God's instructions, Moses sends 12 spies to go up and survey the land, and then to bring a report back to the children of Israel about what they found. Let us hear that report of the 10 spies, at least 10 of the 12 spies. Numbers 13, 25 through 29, and 32 through 33 says,
At the end of 40 days, they returned from spying out the land. And they came to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation of the people of Israel in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. They brought back word to them and to all the congregation and showed them the fruit of the land. And they told him, We came to the land to which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. However, the people who dwell in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And besides, we saw the descendants of Enoch there. The Amalekites dwell in the land of Negev. The Hittites, the Jebusites, and the Amorites dwell in the hill country. And the Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the Jordan. So they brought to the people of Israel a bad report of the land that they had spied out, saying, The land through which we have gone to spy out is a land that devours its inhabitants. And all the people that we saw in it are of great height. And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Enoch, and we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers to them.
Now, the most interesting aspect of this report that we should always note and keep in mind when we think about these 10 spies and where the problem really lies with this report is that, first of all, they didn't lie. They weren't, maybe they exaggerate a little bit, but they don't lie. They gave a positive report about the land. They reported what they found there, in that it truly was a rich and blessed land. It was a land that flowed with milk and honey, as they say. Their comments about the inhabitants are pretty much true as well. There were many Canaanite tribes with armies that occupied the land, and it would be difficult for the Israelites, having lived in the wilderness for 40 years, not having built up an armory or built up soldiers and warriors during that time and trained them and so on. It would be difficult to take them if you're thinking only in earthly terms. The problem with the report and ultimately the desire of all of the Israelites to then overthrow Moses and return back to Egypt is how they responded to that report. And it was the lack of faith that they showed in God. The Israelites failed to trust in the sovereignty of God, and more importantly, in the relationship that God had just forged with them at Sinai. They didn't trust in that covenant and the promises that he had made in that. Doubt and yearning to return to what they saw as the relative safety of Egypt, even if that meant enslavement, that overshadowed any faith that they might have in God. Ultimately, they failed to have faith, or in other words, they failed to trust the love of God. And again, I don't think it's so much even just trusting it's not just lacking a trust in the power of God. They had seen the power of God. Yeah, we're now a generation removed because the 40 years in the wilderness happened, but there were still a few at this time. Well, actually, no, the 40 years haven't happened. This is 1 year after the Exodus. So everyone here, they had seen the splitting of the Red Sea. They had seen the plagues in Egypt. They had seen the power of God. They knew what was there. So I don't even think it's necessarily that they failed to trust in God's power, but they failed to trust in his love, that he would protect them as he had promised. In contrast to this attitude among the Israelites, we have the two other spies, Caleb and Joshua, who demonstrated that but if not faith, which is to say they demonstrated obedience to the relationship that they had with God. The words of their faith are shown in Numbers 13:30, which says,
But Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, Let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are well able to overcome it.
And then in Numbers 14:6-9.
And Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had spied out the land, tore their clothes and said to all the congregation of the people of Israel, The land which we passed through to spy it out is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord delights in us, he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land that flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not fear the people of the land, for they are bread for us. Their protection is removed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them."
So in the first passage, we see the zeal, that faithful zeal of Caleb to obey God. As he heard the other spies give this report of the numerous tribes and the power of those tribes that inhabited the land, he interrupted them, and he called the Israelites to go up immediately and to possess the land. His faith in God was simply to hear the promises and the commands, and therefore to obey. In the second passage, we're given more insight, though, as to why Caleb and Joshua possessed this faith. In verse 8, it is declared that if the Lord delighted in them, he would give them the land. Now, the word delighted there, chafetz, means that there's a feeling of strong, positive attraction to something. We would probably call it affection. So what they were really saying is that if he delights in us, not meaning he's pleased with us because we obey, but more because God has affection for us, because he has love for us, that we're going to be successful, even though the odds look against it. So their faith led them to obedience to possess the land that rested on their belief that the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, this was a God with whom they had not only entered into just a contractual covenant, like God's obligated to fulfill his promises, but they had actually entered into a relationship in which there was this strong sense of affection for them. Again, more think of it as the parent looking at his children. They were able to obey God's commands, Joshua and Caleb, because they recognized the righteousness of God to keep his promises. They recognized the sovereignty of God to carry out both his promises and his protection. So God doesn't lie. He's going to keep the promises. He has the power and the ability to do it. But most importantly, God has the love that his will is to protect his children. Unfortunately, Israel did not learn quickly from the discipline that was then extolled upon them for their lack of faith, because as we know, they didn't listen to Joshua and Caleb. And as a result, they ended up yielding to the report and really kind of more the interpretation of the report of the 10 spies. And as a result, they'd wander in the wilderness for 40 years. And throughout those 40 years, there would be the loss of an entire generation, and actually really 2 generations, because it was all those above the age of 20 that weren't able to enter the promised land. Yet the Israelites during that time would again and again fail to show obedient faith to God. And this would be seen time after time in their murmuring and their complaining against God and complaining against his anointed mouthpiece Moses. We see it in Korah's rebelling and the murmuring of the people who complained after those who opposed Moses were swallowed up by the earth. And we see it in other instances where they murmur against God, such as in Numbers 22:5 and again in 21:4-6.
Now there was no water for the congregation, and they assembled themselves together against Moses and against Aaron. And the people quarreled with Moses and said, "Would that we had perished when our brothers perished before the Lord. Why have you brought the assembly of the Lord into this wilderness, that we should die here, both we and our cattle? And why have you made us come up out of Egypt to bring us to this evil place? It is no place for grain or figs or vines or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink." From Mount Hor they set out by the way of the Red Sea to go around the land of Edom. And the people became impatient on the way. And the people spoke against God and against Moses. "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no food and no water, and we loathe this worthless food." And the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, so that many people of Israel died.
In each of these instances, we see a lack of faith from the people in God's promises and in his sovereignty. But those both ultimately are the result of a lack of faith in their relationship with him. Those who murmured against the Lord not only lacked faith to trust in God's ability to see them through difficult times in the wilderness. After all, again, he does it every day. Every day the manna was there. They knew that he provided for them, and he had the ability to provide for them. But they lacked that faith that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego showed. They weren't able to stand and say they would remain obedient simply because they had a relationship with God. And that's what they truly valued. And it didn't really matter whether God preserved them the next day or not in their wilderness wanderings. It really didn't matter if the man is there the next day. It really didn't matter if God protected them when they went up to take the land. What mattered was they trusted in God that we have a relationship, you love us, and therefore you will always do what's best for us. Now, the demonstration of obedient faith that acts solely upon a recognition of who God is and our relationship with him, it's also found in the New Testament. We see one of the greatest examples of this in the Gentile centurion who asked Yeshua to heal his servant. Luke 7, 1 through 8 tells us.
After he had finished all his sayings in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum. Now a centurion had a servant who was sick and at the point of death, who was highly valued by him. When the centurion heard about Yeshua, he sent to him elders of the Jews, asking him to come and heal his servant. And when they came to Yeshua, they pleaded with him earnestly, saying, "He is worthy to have you do this for him, for he loves our nation, and he is the one who built us our synagogue." And Yeshua went with him. And when he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends, saying to him, "Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. Therefore I did not presume to come to you, but say the word, and let my servant be healed. For I too am a man set under authority, with soldiers under me. And I say to one, go, and he goes, and to other, come, and he comes. And to my servant, do this, and he does it."
So these words he speaks to Yeshua. The centurion demonstrates this great understanding of who Yeshua is and the authority that he possessed. He understood that Yeshua had the authority to heal. And therefore there was no reason to doubt that he could heal his servant, the centurion's servant, despite whatever traditions and customs might separate the two men. As such, the centurion acts upon this faith, and he's reasoning, as I hold authority over others, I'm a person that holds authority over others, and they follow what is done. This man, Yeshua, he holds authority over the physical health of others. He must have heard the reports, or maybe even seen people that were healed by him. And that if this man has such authority, I can just trust that he can heal my servant. And therefore, Yeshua responds proclaiming the following in Luke 7, 9 through 10.
When Yeshua heard these things, he marveled at him. And turning to the crowd that followed him, he said, "I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith." When those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the servant well.
And there's numerous examples of this type of faith listed throughout the scriptures. And I'm just going to highlight a couple more here and kind of quickly, but we find them, in chapter 11 of Hebrews, where we get this account of numerous acts of obedience by the people of God. And in each of these instances, it speaks of the individual acting because of their faith in who God is, not because of an expectation of the consequences of their faith. Again, it's not seeking rewards, it's not seeking the avoidance of punishment, but it's always like, I know who God is, and I have a relationship with him, and I therefore am responding to that. So let's look at a few examples here. So we hear first in Hebrews 11, 5 through 6.
By faith Enoch was taken up so that he should not see death, and he was not found because God had taken him. Now before he was taken, he was commended as having pleased God. And without faith it is impossible to please him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him.
So Enoch was taken by God because of his faith. And the writer of Hebrews emphasizes that Enoch's pleasing faith consisted of two things: believing that God is, and believing that God is a rewarder. Now that second part may sound as if genuine faith is concerned with the rewards. But notice that it says that God is a rewarder, which is a faith centered on the nature of God, not the actual rewards itself. It's a faith that rests upon who God is. Furthermore, it says he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him, which implies that the reward being spoken of is not material blessings, and it's not even spiritual blessings, but the reward is a relationship with God. If you seek God, you'll be rewarded by a relationship with him. Another example, Hebrews 11, 8 through 10 states,
By faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith he went to live in a land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God.
So here we see Abraham, who responded to this command by God to leave his family, to leave his country, and to seek out a new land that would be his descendants' inheritance. Now again, we do see a promise of reward attached to this obedience, but it was a reward that Abraham wouldn't see, Isaac wouldn't see, Jacob wouldn't see, Jacob's 12 sons wouldn't see. None of them would see this in their lifetimes. But it's important here again to recognize that it was not really the promise of this reward that prompted Abraham to act, but merely Abraham's understanding of who was commanding him. That's what led him to obedience. For it is only through such faith that we can understand Abraham's willingness, his willing obedience to follow after this command, but even more so the greater, to leave your country and home, that's a big thing, but then to really understand the greatest command, the most difficult command that Abraham had to respond to, which was that to sacrifice Isaac, his son, the son that he had been told would be the one to inherit this initial promise and would inherit the covenant. Hebrews 11, 17 through 19 reads,
By faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, Through Isaac shall your offspring be named. He considered that God was able to even raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back.
So having already received a promise of reward, Abraham was tested to see if his faith was really in the reward, or was it in the one who provided the reward? Is he doing this because I promised him great things, or is he doing it because he's responding to me, the Lord? And in his act of willingness to offer up Isaac as a sacrifice, which again, to offer up Isaac as a sacrifice would suggest that God is changing the covenant, that all these promises are now going to be taken away, because everything was supposed to be promised through Isaac. But Abraham still acts. He trusted, he had the faith in the sovereignty of God, that even, but if not, even if Isaac dies, even if that, I still believe God's going to fulfill his promises. And even reason, and we read right there, even if it's necessary that God would raise one from the dead to fulfill the promise. Finally, Hebrews 11, 32 through 39 tells us,
And what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release, so that they might raise again to be a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging, and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sown in two. They were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, and mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. And all these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised.
In each of these examples, the people of great faith, they endured trials. And we see that during those trials, what drove their faith was a trust in who God is, and that his promises would not return void because his holiness to keep his promises and his sovereignty to carry out those promises. even though none of these individuals received the promise, by which the author of Hebrews means here is that none of them saw Mashiach come during their lifetime. They still endured everything, all the trials that they faced. They endured it because they looked for the Messiah to come. But if not during their lifetime, then the appointed time in the future. For their faith allowed them to see beyond their own individual circumstances and realize that because of who God was, is, and will always be, the promise, the Mashiach, would come regardless of how God intervened in their own lives. And for that reason, God deserved obedience. These examples of obedient faith that respond directly to the nature of God and to his relationship with us, rather than those consequences of obedience, it raises an important question for all of us to ask. I would be surprised if there was anyone here who has not at least once considered, what type of life would I live if God did not require us to be a holy people? What limits to your behavior would you observe? And how would you act towards other people if God had not given commands for his people to follow? Or what if those theologians and those false teachers out there who claim a loving God can never condemn anyone, and therefore universal salvation belongs to all, what if they were actually correct? What would be the day-to-day consequences of such a reality? So this is part, like I said, you need to do some self-reflecting. This is the time of the year to do this. So this hypothetical question that I put to you this morning is similar. Let's say that God had given his commandments to us, but that there were no consequences attached to obedience or to sin. That although he showed us how to live a righteous life through the commandments, he wasn't concerned with whether or not you actually followed them. You know, this is just advice I'm giving you, and you can choose to follow it if you like or not. And there's no blessings if you follow. There's no curses if you don't following. You know, you'll live this exact same life whether you follow them or not. And, you know, in this hypothetical, you'd have the same afterlife regardless of whether you follow them or not. What would be the result? How would you live? How would you treat others? How would your relationship with God, what would your relationship with God be like? If this question had been asked at the beginning of today's message before we looked at a faith that is able to state confidently, but if not, it would be interesting to hear the responses of our hearts. How many of us would immediately go to that sin that we struggle with the most in our deepest, darkest parts in our lives and think about, well, I could indulge in that. If there's no consequences to that sin, I could indulge in it. I could give in to that, whatever that is in the flesh. How many would think about that pork chop or that bacon that you no longer eat? How many of you would go to, I could stay in bed and sleep until noon on Saturdays? How many would entertain even darker thoughts that strike at the very heart of loving our neighbor as ourselves? And if we were all of a sudden freed from that obligation? And yet, even if the first inclination of the flesh is to consider the sins that we could then indulge in, if there's no consequences to sin, we see from examples like Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, and from Caleb and Joshua, and from the centurion who sought after Yeshua, that in reality, if we love God, if we honor and acknowledge who he is, if the blessings and the curses disappear, it shouldn't change our lives in any shape or form, because we should still desire to obey God's commandments simply because he loves us. This advice, if it was only advice and not commandments, it would be in our best interest to have a relationship with him, and therefore he deserves obedience. The answer to the but if not scenario should be the very same as the answer to the reality of, there are consequences to the decisions we make. History's not been kind to the memory of the Sadducees, those Jewish leaders of Yeshua's time who controlled the temple and consisted of a school of thought that denied the resurrection of the dead, the eternal nature of the soul, and who took Torah in its most literal sense, and they did not even review the rest of the Tanakh as having the same authority as the Torah. Now, part of the reason the Sadducees are seen in such a bad light is that We have none of their own original writings. We don't know why they thought what they did. We have no opportunity to hear their perspectives and their reasons from their own voice. Instead, we only know of them because they opposed the Mashiach, and we see that in the New Testament. And we know of them because of what the Pharisees wrote about them. But the Pharisees were their political and theological opponents. So obviously the Pharisees had no reason to portray the Sadducees in a positive light. Now, all of this being the case, and all these things that were problems with the Sadducees, again, they denied the resurrection. They denied the eternal nature of the soul. They denied that the rest of the Tanakh had the same authority as the Torah, meaning that they devalued the prophets and the writings. Despite all of that, and their errors, and even despite their rejection of the Messiah, which obviously is very problematic, I think we should give pause. There is one thing, they have one redeemable value, one redeemable virtue. Because the Sadducees denied the resurrection of the dead, and they denied the eternal nature of the soul, meaning that when you die, that's it. There's nothing else. There is no rewards or curses after this life. If that's what you truly believed, but they still followed the commandments of God, why were they doing it? Why did they have it? And they were known for their great zeal of following the commandments very literally. There's no concern for the afterlife. There's no concern for their status of their souls. Likewise, there's no concern for rewards in Olam Haba. So this would seem to suggest that to some degree, they understood that obedience to God's commandments should be followed simply because of who God is. That He's the Lord and that He's the sovereign over the Jews. So the question I pose to you this morning is whether or not your faith is strong enough to lead you in obedience in a similar manner. That you would be obedient without a promise for a reward, and without any fear of being punished. In conclusion, we should all be striving for the Hain law faith, or but if not faith. While we can rest our hope in deliverance from our enemies and preservation during the trials in our lives, we should strive for a greater faith, a more mature faith that expects blessings, but is content to simply humble ourselves before God and obey His commandments because He's worthy of such devotion and love. And we trust and we know that He loves us. For once we move beyond our concerns with the consequences of obedience and rebellion, we can begin then to just focus on our love for God and our relationship with Him. And we can make His commandments a true matter of the heart, rather than any outward concerns about our position in this life or the afterlife. It is at this moment that we as the followers of Yeshua can begin to center our efforts on just nourishing our relationship with God. No expectations from it other than I get to have a relationship with my Creator. As John 14:21 states,
"Whoever has my commandments and keeps them, he it is who loves me. And he who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I will love him and manifest myself to him."
Amen. It is our duty to praise the Master of all, to ascribe greatness to the author of creation. For He made us unlike the nations of the lands, and has not placed us like the families of the earth. He's not made our portion like theirs, and our lot like all their multitudes. And we bend the knee and bow and acknowledge our thanks before the King over kings, the Holy One, blessed be He. He stretches out heaven and establishes earth's foundation. And the seat of His glory is in the heavens above, and the presence of His power is in the most exalted heights. He is our God, there is none other. True is our King, there is nothing beside Him, as it is written in His Torah. And you shall know this day and take to your heart that the Lord, He is God, in the heavens above and on the earth below. There is none other. Amen.